Is UCLA edge rusher Laiatu Latu worth a top 10 pick?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/locked on to get started. So, guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka the Jolly Green Giant, aka Mr. aka been covering the Falcons for far too long, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, coming at you from an undisclosed location in Bad News, Virginia, visiting the folks for the weekend, hometown of Michael Vick and Ella Fitzgerald. So we are here with you doing this podcast, and appreciate each and every one of you that's an everydayer, and make this podcast your first listen, first watch of the day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So at the end of today's episode, we'll answer a listener question and talk about Bijan Robinson's potential breakout season this year. But the bulk of our conversation will be focused on Mock Draft Monday, where we look at a recent mock draft that has a Falcon selection, and we break down the player that they have, and that player will be UCLA edge rusher Laiatu Latu. And why I don't know if he is really should be in the mix for the Falcons' 8th overall selection, but let's jump into that conversation. This mock draft comes from Hayden Winks of Underdog Football, and I thought his mock is very interesting. The first 7 picks are very interesting, right? First pick, he has the Chicago Bears selecting quarterback Caleb Williams from USC. Number 2, Washington takes quarterback Jaden Daniels of LSU. Number 3, New England takes quarterback J.J. McCarthy of Michigan. Number 4, Minnesota trades up with Arizona to go get quarterback Drake May of North Carolina. And been thinking about this scenario the last couple of days, and I feel like because this is the weirdest, craziest scenario, like this is probably how the draft is going to go. So shout out to Hayden for getting this one. But I've been thinking about this, like this exact scenario where JJ McCarthy jumps up to 3 and the Vikings are able to land Drake May somehow, some way. No reason why they could do it. But anyway, number 5, the Arizona Cardinals trade back into the top 10 from 11 after trading with the Vikings with the Chargers to get wide receiver Marvin Harrison Jr. out of Ohio State. Number 6, the Giants take wide receiver Malik Neighbors, LSU. Number 7, the Jets trade up for the 3rd wide receiver, in this case, wide receiver Rome Odunze out of Washington. And that leaves us with
8th pick, the Atlanta Falcons select
edge rusher Laiatu Latu out of UCLA. Number 9, Chicago takes Olu Fashanu, the offensive tackle for Penn State. And number 10, Tennessee takes Joe Alt after trading out with the Jets. Joe Alt, offensive tackle, Notre Dame. So very interesting top 10 for Hayden Winks. And, I think there's a real possibility that that's exactly how it breaks down. The one pick that I have an issue with is the Laiatu Latu pick, at this point in time. But let's talk the positives with Laiatu Latu before we get to some of my concerns with Latu. And I think a big selling point on Latu is sort of that Jimmy Lake connection, right? The Falcons' new defensive coordinator coached Latu at Washington, right? Latu played 1 season at Washington in 2019. Then he got injured, suffered a neck injury, and then sat out the next 2 years before transferring to UCLA. And these last 2 years at UCLA, he has been a dominant, one of the most productive pass rushers that PFF has ever charted, and their data goes back basically a decade. He earned the highest pass rush grade among edge rushers this past year. He was number 2 in pass rush win rate this past year. And then when you eliminate, screens and play action passes, rollouts, and super quick throws, where they have their sort of true pass set, where it's really more of a measure of true passing ability, he was the number 1 highest win rate in those situations for PFF and was number 2 in that area last year. So you're getting a player, I think, in Latu that has a high floor, right? One of the things I like about Latu is his ability to rush from multiple spots, right? He's comfortable being moved all around the formation and was consistently able to win, whether he was lined up at over the left tackle, the right tackle, the left guard, the right guard, all that more, right? He has great hand usage, right? He's going to use swipes, chops, rips, swims, even spin moves from time to time. He is basically a very technical rusher. He is as good a technical rusher as I have seen at the collegiate level, going back probably more than a decade, right? He also has good athletic testing in one specific area that we know correlates with sack production in the NFL. We've talked about this before in the podcast. That's the 3-cone and short shuttle, the agility metrics, right? He was 70th percentile among edge rushers in those two metrics. And we've talked before about how those metrics correlate the most to actual sack production among first-round edge rushers, right? He also had a very high sack conversion rate during his last 2 years at UCLA. I don't know what the college numbers are, but I know the average NFL in terms of pressures to sacks, like how many of your pressures turn into sacks, is like 15%. Latu's was like 21% these last 2 years, right? And that's what Jarvis Davis, our guest on the most recent episode this past Thursday/Friday, was talking about, with Latu's ability to finish plays, right? Now, initially I was very high on Latu over the last year or two, right? I was ready to declare even before last year's draft that, he's a better prospect than Will Anderson. Now, the more I've watched of Latu, the less impressed I have been of him. Now, the question, of course, is Latu worth a top 10 pick? I don't think so, but a lot of that obviously depends on what your definition of what is worth a top 10 pick. Again, I think he's a good player. I think he brings a pedigree. I think he brings proven production. And some of these metrics, especially some of these ones that PFF is measuring these guys in, I think there's enough evidence to say that these translate to the next level. So you're probably going to get a productive player, but are you going to get the type of player that I think merits this high selection? Because I think when you're taking a player in the top 10, I do think ceiling does matter, right? I think Latu has a high floor, but I don't think his ceiling is significantly higher than his floor. And if you want to take the top defensive player in the draft, which is, what the Falcons did in Hayden Winks' mock draft, and a lot of people are thinking that's what the Falcons are going to do with that 8th overall selection, I think going with a high floor, low ceiling type of player may not be the best bet. And I'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, it is April and the sports calendar is fully loaded, and FanDuel is making it even more exciting to get in on that action, because right now new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet money on the tournament, Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL, and so much more. And of course, April means it's NFL draft season. And if you're willing to bet on the Falcons selecting Laiatu Latu, or maybe another team selecting Laiatu Latu with the 8th overall selection, he has currently 10-1 odds over at FanDuel. And I feel like that line has moved in Latu's favor in recent weeks. So why not go and sign up at FanDuel right now so you can take advantage of those odds, right? All you got to do is go visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet a big win. FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. So, guys, before we continue today's Mock Draft Monday, if you're tired of watching all these other 4-letter networks and you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting, why not tune into a brand new 4-letter network? That is LOPN, right? Which is the Locked On Podcast Network. Make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, free 24/7 sports streaming channel on YouTube, as well as a free Amazon Fire TV channels app. And if you're looking for more local flavor than those national networks give you, of course, Locked On Sports Atlanta has you covered. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So for me with Latu, I'm not really concerned about the injury stuff, right? Like, my issues with him are not related to the injury stuff, right? That's something that team doctors will have to sort out. I'm not a doctor, so I don't know that information. I know the comments in the chat are already raging with people sitting here acting like they know what they're talking about when it comes to Latu's injury stuff. And it's like, you'll have people pro or against it, Latu, in that way. And it's just like, we don't know anything about that. So to me, that's not really a factor in how I evaluate players. Like, that's a factor that team doctors know about. I don't have a medical degree. I'm not looking at the x-rays. I'm not doing the MRIs or anything like that. So I don't speculate on that. So, it is a factor in how a player works out in the NFL, but I can't speak to how big a factor it is because I don't know that information. So basically, if anybody, again, you're entitled to your opinion, but I'm just sitting here going like, people are just talking out their butts when they talk about the injury stuff, especially us normies on the internet. But, going with Latu, the timeline for me with Latu has been a bit of a roller coaster because, as I mentioned before, like I was very high on Laiatu Latu. Like this time last year, I was like, he's better than Will Anderson. He's a top 5 pick. He's all this stuff. And then as we got through the season, watching him continue to dominate the Pac-12, to me, the game that stood out to me was the Oregon State game where he got to face Taliase Fuaga, who's probably going to be a top 12, 15 pick in this year's draft. And he kind of got shut down in that game. And I was like, okay, well, that's kind of a one-off. Let's see what he can do. And that's part of the reason why you've heard me talk before about going down to the Senior Bowl and wondering if Latu could win in different ways. And he didn't, or he didn't win in different ways. And, it raises the question of whether he can win in different ways. I'm skeptical of it. And then he goes to the combine. He has some ho-hum jumps, right, that, sort of correspond to your first step quickness. And then I start watching more of the All-22 in recent weeks, especially in the last couple of weeks, because I'm noticing a lot more people on Twitter sort of expressing, oh, I like Latu. He's my number one. And like, to me, it's like over this process, he's been kind of my third guy behind Dallas Turner of Alabama and Jared Verse of Florida State. So I went back and watched more All-22 of him, especially against the upper echelon offensive tackles that he faced this year. And there were like 3 guys that are like NFL quality. Fuaga from Oregon State, who's going to be a first-round pick this year. Jordan Morgan of Arizona, who may be a first-round pick, but certainly will be a top 50 pick. And then Jonah Monheim, who's the left tackle for USC, who's going to be probably a first or second-round pick next year. And so what stood out is he wasn't very productive against those 3 guys in the 3 games I saw. And part of that is owed to, I think, my biggest knock on Latu, he's kind of a one-note guy, right? And I think being as good a technician as he is, only being a technician, to me, without having a significant speed or power component, to me, I think lowers your ceiling as a pass rusher in the NFL. That like you have to have some sort of other physical gift, in my opinion, to really maximize that technical aspect of your game. Right? Because I think at the next level, you're going to see offensive tackles that have much better technique than a lot of the guys he was facing in the Pac-12 and elsewhere these past couple of seasons in college, right? And, in those 3 games, I think I maybe have counted like 1 hurry that he had gotten in those 3 games, and maybe that was on maybe 30 snaps. And you may sit there and go, oh, 30 snaps is not a whole lot. But like I think an average pass rusher would get maybe 2 or 3 pressures or hurries on 30 snaps, and a good one would get 4 or 5. And so to me, him only getting 1 against Monheim, to me was notable. Now, granted, he didn't get a ton of snaps against those guys because what they did in those games, UCLA, is like they didn't put him against their best guys. And like, that's good coaching, right? Like, I'm not mad at UCLA for not putting the best versus the best so to make our NFL draft evaluations easier. It's like, put Latu against the worst offensive lineman on the team, and that's what we talk about with his ability to line up in multiple spots, and that's what they did. If the right guard was the liability, the weakness, the weakest link in the chain, they would go after that guy. And so, Latu was productive in those games, but not against the quality offensive tackles. And the main reason to that is because those guys typically don't do the thing that a lot of college offensive tackles do, which is punch with both hands, right? A lot of his wins, Latu's that is like when a guy would punch with both hands, he would sort of swat their hands down and they would get overextended. In the NFL, offensive tackles punch with one hand. If you punch with both hands in the NFL, you're not going to last in the NFL very long, right? And, I talked about this with Jarvis with like Lane Johnson. Lane Johnson is famous because Lane Johnson doesn't punch at all. He's going to counter your counter, right? He's always going to react to what you do. And I think more NFL offensive tackles are going to do that. And they're going to ask Latu, essentially what that does is it requires Latu to kind of have to win with speed or power. Like if he's going to be the reactor, if tackles are going to react off of what he does rather than what he typically does is react what the tackle does, right? They punch and he chops or swipes, right? And instead, NFL offensive tackles, I think, are going to be like, okay, well, I'm not going to punch and you're not going to be able to move me by bull rushing me in my chest, nor are you going to get around me because you don't have that speed or power element to your game. Right. And so like, to me, like when I look at a rusher that has a great cross chop like Latu potentially has, to me, the guys that maximize that move are like guys that really have the speed to challenge it. So Yannick Ngakoue is a great example of this, right? And then you contrast that with Adrian Claiborne, who didn't have quite that level of speed and also had a very good cross shot. But I think that's the difference between why Yannick Ngakoue averages like 9.5 sacks every year, and Adrian Claiborne throughout his NFL career has only averaged like 5.5 sacks. And so like that to me is where Latu is more Claiborne than he is Ngakoue, because he doesn't have that necessarily that first step quickness. Now, when I talk about Latu's not necessarily having athleticism, a lot of people will be like, well, look at his RAS score, his relative athletic score, or RA score, right? And it's, this is where I can go on my rant, my anti-RAS rant, because I think it's a little misleading, right? He's got a 9.33 score, which suggests that he's a 93rd percentile athlete in terms of overall athleticism. But I have two main gripes with RAS. And I think RAS overvalues height and weight. And I think, especially for a lot of positions in the NFL, height isn't really that consequential. Like, I get why it is, because it's like, let's get the biggest, fastest, biggest, athletes and measure that. But like, height isn't really that valuable for most positions in the NFL. Like, being 2 inches taller than another guy, it doesn't make you a better athlete than him. It just means you're 2 inches taller. The other issue I have with RAS is I think their database is too deep. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, but like they're looking at far too many players that I don't think really matters, right? Like, Mock Draftable, which is, mockdraftable.com, which is the preferred website I like to use when it comes to using these percentiles, right? That I referred to earlier, 70th percentile, that stuff, right? They're mostly looking at combine data. They're mostly looking at guys that are drafted, right? And I think that's more valuable than what RAS is doing, relative athletic score, which is looking at a much deeper pool of players, including undrafted free agents, as well as going back, like they have data from the late 80s or whatnot. And I like, to me, because or at least I know, having done the research many years ago, that roughly half of drafted players are out of the league in 5 years. I think including a giant pool of undrafted free agents that like 90% of those guys will never play in the NFL actually kind of waters down, right? And so it leads to certain players, like, for example, right, like Latu's 10-yard split is 69th percentile according to Mock Draftable when you're comparing him to drafted players among edge rushers. But for RAS, it's like 88th percentile. So it's like you get like a 20% bump, right, with RAS to your score that I think is really reflective, because it's including all those undrafted players that are just like not good athletes and won't ever make it in the NFL. And then the other issue is like, yes, it's cool that RAS has like information on Tony Mandarick, who was like the original workout warrior in like 1989, I'm sorry. Can't do it. 1989. And that's cool that they have them in this database, but why is that applicable to any player today? Like, I don't care about, athletes from 35 years ago that don't really have any impact on today's NFL in terms of comparing guys. Like, give me modern NFL athletes, and Mock Draftable goes back to like 1999 instead of 1989. So that to me is my issues with RAS. Now, RAS is probably the best metric we have, right? Because Spark, and 3sigmaathlete.com kind of stopped updating, a couple of years ago. So to me, Spark is a better measure of overall athleticism, but because we don't have that information from like the last 3 years, we can't really compare and contrast. So that's my issue with RAS. And so like when people, cite Latu's RAS score as like indicative of, he's a better athlete than people give him credit, like I don't think that's necessarily true. He's like a 5 out of 10, 6 out of 10 athlete, right? But not this 9 out of 10 athlete is basically the point I'm trying to get across. Now, a lot of these issues I have with Latu, Brett Coleman did a nice video on YouTube this past week, breaking some of this stuff down. I agree with everything he says. I just think it's going to be a bigger issue than what Brett indicated going up against a quality competition in the NFL. I plan on doing one for the Locked On Falcons Insiders. You can join the link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons. It's 14. You basically sign up today and get it free later this week when it probably drops on Friday, as those video breakdowns do. And I'll illustrate a lot of these issues that I have with Latu looking at the film and whatnot. But I want to make it clear. Like, I don't think Latu is a bad player. I think he's going to be a good pro. I just don't think he's going to be an alpha, right? And if you're drafting the first edge off the board and potentially the top defensive player in the draft, like, you want someone who's going to really move the needle. And I don't know if Latu is going to be that guy, because I think he relies heavily on racking up production against lesser talent. And to me, that's what's funny about this, because like I hear a lot of people comparing Dallas Turner to Vic Beasley, and I feel like Latu and Beasley have much more overlap, because that was the same way with Vic Beasley, because he was kind of a one-note guy that needed to face lower level of competition so he could win with his speed, right? Now, obviously, Latu wins more from a technical standpoint, but I still think it's kind of a similar issue, right? And, you talk about these three top tackles that he faced this past year, guys that are projected to be first or second round picks, and like, that was where I disagree. I slightly disagree with Brett Coleman, because he's like, oh, there's going to be guys that will be able to shut him down, but I think there's plenty of bad tackles. And I'm just like, 60%, if the season started tomorrow, 60% of the top tackles on NFL depth charts would be first or second round picks. And then if you assume like this year's draft, given how deep it is at tackles, probably adds like 10 more first or second round picks that will be starting on Sundays this fall, like that increases the number to 75%. And so for me, like, there's going to be a significant portion of tackles in the NFL that I just don't think, Latu is physically gifted enough to beat. And so that's where, for me, like, if the Falcons are going to take Latu, I would much rather prefer them trade back, maybe in that 17 to 20 range, or even further back, and, take Latu, especially if Turner or Verse are gone at that point in time. That to me makes the most sense, to take Latu then, as opposed to taking Latu over those other two guys who I think have considerably higher ceilings than Latu. Now, maybe they don't have nearly the same floor, although I would argue Verse's floor is probably just as high, if not higher, than Latu's is. And that's why, to me, like, that conversation at 8 really is, to me, a Dallas Turner or Jared Verse conversation, not a Dallas Turner, Jared Verse, or Laiatu Latu conversation. But that's me. I know there are going to be plenty of people that will disagree with me on that notion, but that's kind of how I feel. Again, I think Latu will be a productive player. He'll probably be a guy that can reliably get 6, 8, 10 sacks in a season, especially in those years where he gets sort of the luck of the draw and faces, several bad tackles that he can pad his numbers against. But in terms of going up against quality pass rush, quality offensive tackles, which you'll probably see 50, 60 or more % of the time in the NFL, like, I don't know if he's going to be that guy that you can trust to get more than like a couple of pressures in those games, rather than being that sort of guy that is sort of the alpha in your pass rush that you're expecting. He can go up against the high level tackles and get 3, 4, 5 or more pressures, like the top, like a typical top 10 edge rusher is expected to do. So those are my thoughts on Laiatu Latu. Of course, check out the Locked On Falcons, become a Locked On Falcons Insider if you want to get some film to back up this and what I'm talking about. Again, join that link in the description below at joinsubtext.com/LockedOnFalcons, 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month. You also will get access to all my extended all 22 reviews, as well as my film breakdowns of not only the Falcons free agents, which I just recently dropped in the last 2 weeks, as well as looking at 5 of the top quarterback prospects in this draft as well. But we will continue today's episode. The other thing that Locked On Falcons get is they get priority on questions. And we have a question from one of the insiders talking about sort of who's got more breakout potential between Kyle Pitts, Drake London, Bijan Robinson, and Jesse Bates this upcoming season. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, this show is sponsored by BetterHelp, and spring is here, and it's time to get out there and be more social. And that's something I've often struggled with doing in the past. And, you may wonder, what's the right amount of socializing for you? How do you recharge? Maybe you thrive around people. Maybe you need some more alone time. Therapy can give you the self-awareness to build a social life that doesn't drain your social battery. One of the things my therapist has worked on with me is trying to increase my social battery by getting me to try new experiences. I don't think I would have probably attended either of the last 2 Senior Bowls without the help of my therapist, which comes via BetterHelp. So I can not recommend BetterHelp enough. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp Try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Find your social sweet spot with BetterHelp by visiting betterhelp.com/lockedon today, and you'll get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. So let's wrap up with a question from Drew. He says, who do you think has a bigger season? Kyle Pitts, Drake London, Bijan Robinson, Jesse Bates. We all know Bates 8 last season. Can he replicate that? So I'm not going to pick Jesse Bates because we know he's a cheater. And for those of you that don't know what that reference is, that's been a running gag here on the podcast for like the last 4 months. That a lot of Jesse Bates' production comes from him, bailing on what his actual assignment is so that he can sort of cheat and undercut a route underneath. He basically bails on the deep assignments, and it's kind of a live by the sword, die by the sword. So like, as much as it was fun to watch that, like, I don't know if that's a sustainable way to continue to produce year after year. It can burn you just as much, but we'll see how that goes for Jesse Bates this upcoming season. But among the other three, like, let's talk Bijan. We've talked already about Pitts and London, and how they should benefit from having Kirk Cousins. We haven't really spent any time on Bijan yet this offseason. And it's interesting now that you have Zach Robinson as the offensive coordinator here coming from the Rams, because one of the early comps I had for Bijan Robinson was Todd Gurley, who we saw had a lot of success under Sean McVay his first 2 years with the Rams. And, similar size, speed combination, pass catching ability, I think, with Bijan and Gurley. And you saw Gurley average over 1,900 yards from scrimmage in those first 2 years, where he won like Offensive Player of the Year in one of those 2 seasons, had 40 touchdowns. And I could see Bijan putting up similar production, right, where, he can approach 2,000 yards from scrimmage and potentially get 15, 20 or more touchdowns in a given season in this type of offense. Now, the thing that Gurley had going for him is he didn't have to share the workload. He got over 70% of the running back touches in those 2 years in 2017 and 2018. We talked about this a lot last year, where Bijan wasn't going to get that lion's share of the workload, much to the chagrin of fantasy football folks, which, we predicted months before the regular season happened that fantasy football folks would revolt with Bijan basically sharing the load. And basically, I think I said that he's not going to get more than like 55% of the running back touches. I think he got exactly like 50.5% last year, sharing that workload with Tyler Algier. I think in order to put up Gurley production, you need to see that number increase. Gurley got over 70%, 80% including one of those years. But I do think, Bijan, you'll see an increased workload in this new offense, right? Gurley averaged about 325 touches in the 2-year peak in LA. Bijan had 272 last year. I think there's a greater chance that Bijan's going to get and maybe exceed 300, right? And that probably will involve Tyler Algier being less involved in the offense. He had 204 touches last year, and maybe that number is closer to 150 this year, right? And so if you assume that difference and those 50 touches go to Bijan, and if he once again averages about 5.4 yards per touch, like that would put him over like 700 yards from scrimmage, right? That's basically what peak Nick Chubb did, in his best years in Cleveland. And I could see, a similar workload, different types of running backs, but a similar workload split that you had between Chubb and Kareem Hunt, where he was getting around 150 touches while Chubb was getting over 300 in those years. But a lot's going to depend on how involved is the Falcons run game. I think the Falcons are going to lean on the run game to a certain degree. Like, I don't think they're going to completely swing the pendulum away from Arthur Smith to this pass heavy offense. But I do think they're not going to be as reliant on the run game under Zach Robinson and company as they were under Arthur Smith. But, I think there's a golden opportunity for Bijan to have sort of a breakout year and produce like a top 5 running back like Nick Chubb was, like Todd Gurley was, in terms of, is he going to get 2,000 yards and outproduce Christian McCaffrey? It's possible. Don't get me wrong. It's definitely possible. I wouldn't quite predict it, but I certainly think it's a doable thing. We saw Gurley do that in this offense in year 1 under Sean McVay. I think it's doable for Bijan. I think you're probably more likely to get like 1,700, 1,800 yards type of season for Bijan, which is still very good and would be, top 3, top 5 almost every single year at the running back position. So I think Bijan is due for a big year. So he's my pick, Drew. But, I think we've talked before that Pitts, London, and Bates also could be due for big years, especially, if Jesse Bates decides that he wants to believe in monogamy moving forward. But we'll see how that goes, guys. That's going to do it for us on today's episode. Tomorrow we'll be joined by Josh Kendall of The Athletic to get his thoughts on the Falcons draft plans, and whether or not, Laiatu Latu or one of these other edge rushers is on the table. We'll talk more about possibilities of wide receivers, falling to the Falcons at 8. All that and more is in store for you. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.